Hi all, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment. We are joined this evening to discuss the women's suffrage movement in South Carolina by Dr. Melissa Walker. Dr. Walker is the Emerita George Dean Johnson Jr. Professor of History at Converse College, where she taught for 21 years. Her research has focused on women's history and the labor history in the South. She is the author of several books on the topic, including one called All We Knew Was to Farm, about farm women between the world wars. She grew up on a dairy farm in Tennessee, and she lives in Spartanburg with her husband, where she runs Heyday Coaching, a life coaching business that specializes in helping people meet their personal and career goals and navigate life's transitions. If you have any questions for Dr. Walker, please submit them in the Zoom chat box and I'll ask them as time permits. Dr. Walker, thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me, Cheryl. I'm really delighted to be here and talk about one of my very favorite topics to talk about. And I like to really focus on the women's suffrage movement in South Carolina because we hear about the women nationally, but the local women who were so much the backbone of the movement often get overlooked. I'll just talk very briefly with some background, and I'm going to be switching back and forth with a PowerPoint to show you a few pictures now and then. But I want to start by saying that the women's suffrage movement was really a social justice movement and a civil rights movement, with voting being one of these basic civil rights. And of course, women's suffrage activists were often pushing for other basic civil rights for women as well. And like all social justice and civil rights movements, the women's suffrage movement reflected both the highest ideals of our country and also all of our divisions. And that's really important to keep in mind. Activists in the movement split over the ends and the means for achieving women's suffrage, and race and class cleaved that movement. And so it's important to understand that this was an unfinished movement. When women achieved the right to vote, African American women in the South, Native American women, a lot of Asian American women were still not entitled to the vote. So that's a really important point. And I'll just give you a little background if you aren't familiar with it, is about the legal status of women before the suffrage movement. In every state except Louisiana, which ran by the Napoleonic Code, English common law covered the basic framework for that state's laws. And under English common law, women were in a status known as coverture, which essentially meant that their identity was considered to be covered by that of a man. A man was expected to act on their legal behalf. So women had no right to control of their wages. They had no right to child custody in cases of divorce. They could inherit money from their fathers, not their mothers usually, but they could inherit from their fathers, and the husband was entitled to control that money. Lots of other restrictions on women in society. So all of these kinds of restrictions helped feed into the women's suffrage movement. And the movement actually had its birth in the abolition movement, the movement to abolish slavery. And the first women's suffrage activists were women who began to, as they pushed for women's right, for the freedoms and the civil rights of enslaved African Americans, began to see that women often were denied some of those same rights. And many of these early abolitionist women were in the North. Well, pretty much all of them, except one pair I'll talk about. For example, an African-American woman and novelist named Frances Ellen Harper was one of the early women who began to talk about women's rights and mentioned women's suffrage. Locally, it was the GRIMKE sisters of South Carolina who are our connection for the women's suffrage movement. In the 1830s, the GRIMKE sisters, who were born in Charleston, but also had, their family had a plantation in the lower part of Spartanburg County around Cross Anchor. The GRIMKE sisters became paid speakers for the American Anti-Slavery Society. They had spent some time in Philadelphia, where they were converted to the Quaker faith, and really began to see the way that women were denied their rights, and began to talk about women gaining more of a voice, and even sometimes talking about exercising that voice through the vote. Some of the other women nationally, let's see, I should have been playing slideshow. These are the GRIMKE sisters. They look kind of stern. Remember, they're Quakers, and they dress very plainly. And some of the other women in the movement that you've probably heard of included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's one of the organizers of the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. Her partner in doing that was Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker anti-slavery activist. Sojourner Truth, who was a freed slave who became very active in the movement, and Susan B. Anthony, who joined the movement a couple of years after the Seneca Falls Convention. So these are the national women that we hear so much about. But there were lots of local connections. And it's important to know that before the Civil War, there was very little suffrage activism in South Carolina or in the South. And that's because of the fact that the movement was associated with the anti-slavery movement. And so Southerners linked those two ideas together and thought that women's suffrage would be a first step on the road to anti-slavery or abolition of slavery. The first suffrage organizing happens during the Reconstruction period. And if you remember back to your history books, during the Reconstruction period, at least early in the period, many former Confederates had been stripped of their right to vote, and Republicans were in control of the state legislature. And so there were white and black Republicans involved. And the majority of white Southerners affiliated themselves with the Democratic Party. So the very fact that the suffrage movement is rooted in the Republican Party at that point in time was enough to discredit it with a lot of white Southerners. Many African Americans took an active role in politics. They had seats in the state legislature. They represented us in Congress. And there were also African American women who took an active role. And among them were the ROLLIN sisters of Charleston. They were the daughters of educated free blacks, and they were educated partly by private tutors, and partly they went to Philadelphia and studied before the Civil War. So after the Civil War, they become very active in politics, even though they themselves don't have the rights to vote, but they are pushing for women's right to vote. I was not able to find photos of most of them, but I'll show you a photo of Frances. There were three sisters, Frances, Charlotte, and Louisa. They were founding members of the South Carolina Women's Suffrage Association, and they invited lots of black and white women into that organization. They attended national suffrage meetings, and in fact, sorry, I'm navigating my slides at the same time as Zoom is a challenge here. There we go. In fact, Charlotte Rollin was one of the first people to actually address the first women to address the state legislature, probably the first African-American woman. In 1869, she addressed the legislature and she asked them to give all women the right to vote. She said, "We ask suffrage not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right based on the grounds that we are human beings. And as such, we are entitled to all human rights." Well, you know, her plea fell on deaf ears. And for a while after Reconstruction ended, the suffrage movement collapsed. But in about 1890, the movement became revitalized with the leadership of this woman. Her name is Virginia Durant. Hopefully you can see her. And Virginia Durant was from Fairfax. She was the wife of a small town doctor, but she was also known for her presentations to local groups, her active role in various women's clubs, and she also ran a community newspaper, and she wrote for various publications, including the Charleston News and Courier and the Sumter Freedman. She helped organize local organizations of the suffrage movement all over the state. And in 1893, she followed the lead of Charlotte Rollin, and she petitioned the state legislature to give her her rights as a citizen. She said that she was taxed without her representation and governed without consent. And she objected to being classified with the insane, criminals, and idiots who were not allowed to vote. And that is language from the South Carolina Legal Code. One of her friends, Robert Hempel, who was the editor of the Abbeville Medium and a member of the South Carolina State Senate, introduced her petition to the legislature, and then the Senate did what they always did with, and still do sometimes with legislation they don't want to deal with it, they send it to committee where it dies. But Mrs. Young and her friends did not give up. They invited national speakers to South Carolina, and in 1895, some of these national speakers were touring the state, and newspapers reported that in Greenville, they were heard with respect and pleasure by audiences consisting of the very best people of the city. They were also well received in Spartanburg, and in Charleston, they addressed what one newspaper called large, brilliant, and fashionable audiences. They persisted in their fight, although they were kind of ignored by the state legislature. In 1895, South Carolina had a constitutional convention. And if you remember your history, this was the constitutional convention where the infamous grandfather clause and literacy tests were inserted into the state constitution to deprive African-American men of their right to vote. But the women in the women's suffrage movement aimed to get a provision in the new constitution that would give the right to vote to women who could both read the constitution and owned at least $300 worth of property. So you can see that the idea here is to give the best educated women the right to vote. The state's notorious racist Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman, whose brother incidentally supported women's suffrage, but Pitchfork Ben warned that giving the women the right to vote would endanger all the state's treasured institutions. He pleaded with the state's leaders not to enact a suffrage amendment until they had collected statistics about the birth rate, the death rate, divorces, and other things affecting the everyday social life of the people in the states that had already granted women the right to vote. And there were some states in the West and in the North that had granted women full or partial voting rights. So clearly, a lot of the men in the legislature thought that giving women the right to vote was going to bring all manner of evil on the state. In spite of support from the state newspaper in Columbia, this provision for a plank for women's, or a provision for women's suffrage in the Constitution was defeated with a vote of 26 votes for and 121 against. Mrs. Young was getting up in age by this time. She continued to stay active for a little while. Another amendment was introduced into the General Assembly in 1902, but it failed to pass. And when Mrs. Young died in 1906, the movement lay dormant for another 6 years. And then it was revived in 1912 by a woman named Emily Plume Evans. And here's a Spartanburg connection. So share a picture of what may be a familiar landmark to some of you. This house is on Connecticut Avenue. I'm sorry, it's on Otis Boulevard now. It used to face Connecticut Avenue, but it was moved. And it was the home of Emily Plume Evans. And this is where we get the title of the talk, From Plume Street to the Polls. Emily Plume Evans captured my imagination when my late colleague Jeff Willis told me about her and about her history. She was born in New Jersey and grew up in Connecticut, where her father was a wealthy banker and state legislator. And we don't know much about her education or her early life. But in 1895, South Carolina's dashing bachelor governor, which is what the newspapers called him, his name was John Gary Evans. And he visited Connecticut and reputedly met Miss Plume in church. They courted long distance for 2 years, and in 1897, after he left the governor's office, they were married, and they settled into this new home on Connecticut Avenue in the new Converse Heights neighborhood. And Governor Evans had helped develop this side of Converse Heights, the eastern side of Converse Heights, and he named its main thoroughfare Connecticut Avenue for his bride's home, and one of the side streets where I happen to live, Plume Street, for Emily. So that's just a little aside. But Emily and her husband had a daughter. She became very active in the activities of the Episcopal Church of the Advent and the local General Federation of Women's Clubs chapters. And she was a founding member of the New Era Club, which became a local affiliate of the national women's suffrage movement. Her organization began communicating with women all over the state, and soon in 1912, they had reignited interest in the suffrage movement in the state. And they formed a statewide organization. They brought suffrage leaders from the national organization to South Carolina to speak, just like the earlier generation had. And Emily represented them at national conventions. By the time the South Carolina Equal Suffrage League, which was the statewide organization, had a state convention in 1917, there were 25 local organizations and 3,000 members of the Equal Suffrage Leagues in the state. And that's a lot of people for 1917. The Equal Suffrage League focused on organization and education. They had suffrage parades, they handed out educational literature, and they were trying to win support for the broader suffrage movement. I also want to tell you about a few other very interesting women in the suffrage movement. Get my slides lined up here for you. There are three of the, actually 4 or 5 of them I want to talk about. The first is Susan Pringle Frost. You may know her better as the founding mother of the preservation movement in Charleston. She had been born to a distinguished Charleston family that lost its fortune in the economic depression of the 1890s. And so she took a stenographic course and became eventually the court stenographer for the U.S. District Court in Charleston. But she also became a very active suffrage activist. She thought that the Equal Suffrage League was too conservative, that they ought to join forces with the more radical women like Alice Paul, who were picketing the White House in Washington, D.C. And so she actually left the Equal Suffrage League and went with the National Women's Party. And she actually was one of those women who picketed the White House, though I don't think she was ever arrested like some of them were. Also, some of her friends in Charleston included the Pollitzer sisters, Carrie, Mabel, and Anita. They were very active in community organizations. Carrie helped organize the Free Kindergarten Association, as well as being active in the suffrage movement. And she devised the petition drive and raised the money to bring the admission of women at the College of Charleston. So very interesting person. Her sister Mabel was also a suffrage activist and taught biology at the Meminger Normal School. That was the teacher's school in Charleston. And their youngest sister, Anita, earned a BS in Fine Arts at Columbia University. And if you're an art lover, Anita was the person who introduced Alfred Stieglitz to his future wife, Georgia O'Keeffe. You probably know her better than you know Alfred Stieglitz. But Anita was a very active campaigner in the women's suffrage movement. And finally, one of my favorites is EULALIE CHAFEE SALLEY. And I've heard her name pronounced several different ways, but that's the way I've heard it pronounced most recently. She was, she actually had studied at both Mary Baldwin and at Converse. She married a lawyer who eventually became the mayor of Aiken and had 2 children. And she might have lived the typical life of a small town Southern lady, as they were known at the time, if she hadn't become involved in the 1910 case of Lucy Tillman. Lucy Tillman was the wife of Ben Tillman III, the son of that notorious Pitchfork Ben that I mentioned before. And they had a very tumultuous, Lucy, and I don't have a picture of Lucy, but Lucy and Ben had a tumultuous marriage. He drank and apparently was abusive, physically abusive, and they had separated at times, but they got back together. And she became very ill, probably as the result of a miscarriage. And her husband actually deeded the title to their children. And I'm not kidding you, that's what he did. He issued a deed to his mother for custody of their children. So once she recovered, Lucy spent everything she had on an attempt to regain custody of her children, which she did eventually win in the South Carolina Supreme Court. But her case drew attention to the inequalities that women faced, and it really roused the ire of Eulalie Salley. So Eulalie became a very active suffrage campaigner, and she was also quite the showman. She staged innovative fundraising campaigns. Once she organized a prize fight where she herself fought and people apparently placed bets on who would win. Obviously this is a publicity stunt, but she went door to door in Aiken and the surrounding areas urging men to support women's right to vote, which is obviously the way it had to happen since women couldn't vote. On one occasion, she hired a pilot to fly her over the town of Aiken, scattering suffrage pamphlets all over the place, which was a risky undertaking. Remember, these are the days of the open cockpits. Her husband and lots of other people thought that her activities were scandalous. So he told her she could no longer spend any of, quote, his money on these activities. And by her story, that is the reason that she was motivated to become the first woman in South Carolina to get her real estate license. She did that, started a very successful real estate company. And she actually is credited with helping market the Aiken area to Northerners who came south, and that became quite a winter spot for a lot of wealthy Northerners. So it helped develop the economy in Aiken. There were also African-American women who continued to be active in the movement in this period in the 19-teens. Marion Wilkinson of Charleston and Colin Robinson Embley were both active members of the South Carolina Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, as it was called at the time. And they were also outspoken advocates of giving women the right to vote, and I don't have any photos of them. But these remarkable women and many others fought tirelessly to try to win the right to vote for South Carolina's women. And after one particularly difficult debate about this, one of the national suffrage leaders said, "I am sorrier than ever that South Carolina didn't secede successfully." The idea was, you know, if South Carolina was out of the Union, it would be a much easier fight to get a national amendment. In 1918, Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman, and by that time he is in the US Senate representing South Carolina, and he died in office, and suffrage activists in the state saw a ray of hope. The Senate was only, the House had already passed a suffrage amendment, the US House, and in the US Senate, they were only 2 votes shy of passing the amendment. So the women's suffrage leaders in the state convinced Tillman's successor, a man named William Pollock of Sherall, to vote in favor of the amendment. They were successful in getting his vote, and another senator committed. And so in June of 1919, the Senate passed what became known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, or the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, and President Wilson signed it. Now the fight moved to the states, because as you may recall from your civics class, an amendment to the Constitution has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And the states ratified it pretty quickly until they got to the South, and it became a real challenge in the South. According to one South Carolina journalist, legions of suffragists descended on the General Assembly in January of 1920 when the General Assembly debated this, and they defeated it. They also, the South Carolina General Assembly also passed a joint resolution that condemned the US Congress for passing the 19th Amendment. In spite of the refusal of a lot of southern states to accept the amendment, South Carolina suffragists went to Nashville, Tennessee in August of 1920 when Tennessee was debating it. And that is a wonderful story, and I don't have time to tell it to you now, but the story of Tennessee's ratification by 1 vote is a great story, and I urge you to look it up. Tennessee in August of 1920 became the 36th state and the last one needed to ratify the amendment. So the South Carolina General Assembly, even though they hadn't ratified it, it's national law now and they have to obey it. So they reluctantly passed the enabling legislation that allowed women to register and vote. But at the same time, they passed a new law that excluded women from jury service. Now, women hadn't been called to juries before that, but they hadn't had the right to vote. And since juries are pulled from voter rolls, the idea was they had to protect these women from serving on juries. And legislators claimed that respectable women had no interest in being jurors. But women do begin to vote in South Carolina, starting with the election, November election of 1920. And as you know, South Carolina's women made really slow progress in the realm of legal equality. Of course, because of literacy tests and poll taxes and things like that, many African-American women were still not able to vote in South Carolina even after the 19th Amendment passed. Not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed will African-American women be legally guaranteed the right to vote. No woman served in the state legislature until 1946, when a woman named Harriet F. Johnson was elected. Divorce wasn't legalized until 1949, and only gradually did women in the state start to receive custody of their children. And not until 1967 did an amendment to the state constitution make it possible for South Carolina women to serve on juries. Well into the 1970s, banks required women who wanted to buy cars and houses to have a male cosigner for their loans. And not until 1986 did Elizabeth Johnston Patterson of Spartanburg become the first and so far the only woman to represent our state in the US Congress. And not until 1969 did the General Assembly ratify the 19th Amendment. Now, this is a symbolic step because women had had the right to vote, but women had been urging the state legislature to ratify it for years. And finally, in 1969, they did. And Eulalie Salley was there when the governor signed this law, this amendment into law. She scolded the state's Democrats by pointing out that it was a Republican senator who assured that the amendment was finally approved in the state legislature. And she taunted the legislative leaders saying, "Boys, I've been waiting 50 years to tell you what I think of you." So she finally had the last word, and Eulalie or Eulalie is in the hat standing behind the governor in this photo. She died in 1975. And I can't leave the story until I tell you a little bit about our heroine, Emily Plume Evans. After the suffrage fight, she continued to work on behalf of the state's women and children, pushing for compulsory schooling laws and child labor laws that would prevent children from working in factories at a young age. She became a founding member of the League of Women Voters of South Carolina, which was a nonpartisan organization that emerged and was dedicated to educating voters of both sexes and encouraging women to participate in the political process. And Spartanburg has a very active League of Women Voters chapter still. So if you're interested in getting involved, you might want to check them out. Emily Plume Evans also worked on behalf of the Florence Crittenden Circle, which was an organization that ran homes for unwed mothers. And at the end of her life, in the 1930s, when most Americans were isolationist, and we were here in the United States, we were watching the rise of Nazi Germany, and a lot of Americans were very staunchly isolationist. They did not want to get involved in World War II. And Emily Plume Evans was a very outspoken advocate of getting involved in World War II. She was very worried about the rise of fascism. And she did live to see the US enter the war. She died in April of 1942, and she was buried in her husband's hometown of Edgefield. And I am very sorry to tell you that I have not been able to find a photo of Emily Plume Evans anywhere, but if anybody knows of one, I'd love to hear about it. So that's the brief story of the fight for women's suffrage in South Carolina. And as we celebrate that 100th anniversary today, I just want to remind you that the fight for full political, economic, and legal equality for women continue. There are still restrictions on voting rights for various people among our fellow citizens. And so the fight isn't over. And I ask you to bear that in mind as we move forward. And so now I would be happy to answer any questions people might have.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. That was an incredibly informative overview of our history and how we can proceed going forward. Is anyone in the audience, do you have any questions for Dr. Walker? I would be glad to relay them to her. Just go ahead and type them into the chat window.
There's always a time lag on Zoom.
Very true. I actually had a question. You said that Emily Plume Evans was buried in Edgefield. Do we have the burial site? Is that well known to the public?
Yes. If you look her up on Find a Grave, you will find a photograph of the gravestone where her husband was from Edgefield, and so that's where they were laid to rest. I've also been unable to find out what happened to her daughter, who was also named Emily. So if there are any local historians out there who know anything about Emily Evans, I would love to hear it.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Someone's talking. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I typed a question, but I'm not sure how to how you're going to see it. But I'd like to know, is it true that most South Carolina women in that era opposed women's suffrage? And if so, would you comment about that? Or even
Go ahead.
That's it.
I don't know if we can say most, although I wouldn't be surprised if it was most. And actually across the country, the anti-suffragists included men, but they also included very outspoken contingents of women. You know, change is hard, and there were women who worried that they would lose their protected status. Now, a lot of women didn't have a very protected status in the early 20th century. If you were from a working class family or a farming family, you were working just as hard as a man every day of your life. So, you know, you weren't exactly up on a pedestal. But there were women who, for various reasons, sometimes religious, sometimes just more personal, worried that women would lose certain protections that middle-class white women had if they gained the right to vote. And so, yeah, there were a lot of anti-suffragists among women.
We have a few questions that have come in now. Can you tell me about the relationship between the upstate and Charleston leaders on the issue?
I don't know a great deal about it, except that we have correspondence going back and forth, and they were working together in deciding how to organize and how to lobby their representatives in Congress as well as in the state legislature. So, and then they would have these statewide conventions where leaders from all over the state would assemble, and they would send representatives to the national conventions. And that was part of what EULALIE Sally needed money for, was she wanted to go to these national conventions and didn't have, her husband would let her spend family dollars to travel.
Someone asked about the role of Margaret Sanger.
Margaret Sanger was a person in the national suffrage movement pushing for women's right to vote. And she was also pushing for birth control rights for women. And some of you also know probably that Margaret Sanger was also a eugenicist. She was part of the eugenics means good genes, and she was part of the movement that wanted to promote birth control among so-called, the word they would have used at the time were inferior people, so that more educated white people were reproducing at a higher rate than the so-called lower classes. So Margaret Sanger, and this is what I want to bring home about the suffrage movement and all movements, all social movements, that people make compromises and to get their legislation advanced. And a lot of white women, not just Southern white women, but a lot of white women excluded African-American women from this movement and tried to erase their visibility, both at the time and afterwards, and since then in writing the history, because they worried that if legislators thought that Black women were going to get the right to vote, they would oppose the movement. Also, there were some suffragists who were racist, who did believe that African-American women should not have the right to vote. So that the movement, as wonderful and heroic as it was also flawed, just like all social movements are. And so it's important to keep that in mind. So back to Margaret Sanger. you know, Margaret Sanger was a pioneer of the birth control movement, but her motivations for pushing for it were not completely admirable by our standards today.
Did campaigns, elections take on any kind of different tone or direction once women's suffrage was attained?
It's a very good question, and the answer is slowly. A lot of the campaigning in this period happened in public spaces where women didn't go, like saloons. And sometimes even that was where the ballot box was even located. So one of the things that does happen is that there's a move across the nation to get ballot boxes into public buildings that felt like safe spaces for women. But it was a slow and evolving process. And there was also the issue, I think people thought that women would vote as a block, that women would vote in a very specific way as women. And although there are, and there still is a gender gap, and there are women's issues, women's votes tend to divide kind of like men's votes along class lines and personal interests. And so that was certainly true in the 1920s. The other thing in the 1920s and beyond was that it really took until the 1950s nationwide before women voted in the same numbers as men. And in the South, sometimes that was due to the poll tax, where you had to pay a poll tax to go vote each year. And if you didn't vote 1 year, then next year you had to pay 2 years poll tax. And the year after that, you had to pay 3 years poll tax. And in families where there wasn't a lot of cash, in textile mill families and poor farming families, a lot of times even the men don't have the money to pay the poll tax. But if they're going to pay the poll tax for one member of the family, they're probably going to pay it for the man. So it takes a long time before women become a really distinct political force in the nation.
Somebody noted that Pitchfork Ben did something right. He left his seat open.
That's a very good point. And probably rolled over in his grave.
There have been a few thank yous. Everyone agrees that it's been very informative, and everyone's really appreciative that you've taken the time to be here tonight.
I was happy to do it. I love to talk about these women.
Let's see if we have any final questions. Once again, Dr. Walker, thank you. I feel like I've learned so much just being here and learning from you tonight. Everyone, I appreciate you coming and joining us this evening. We are so glad that we're still able to offer programming to you in this year. So anytime we have a program like this, we're just so excited when we get an audience for it. Someone asked, are there any thoughts on the ERA ratification in South Carolina?
That's a very good question. I don't know whether it would pass if it were put before the legislature today. The ERA is a very interesting piece of legislation in general. If you know anything about it, it basically says that equality under the law shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. That's all it said, except for it was the first and so far the only amendment to the Constitution that had a time limit put on its ratification. And that time limit passed, and Congress extended the time limit, and there was a very active campaign led mostly by women, especially an organization of women called the Eagle Forum, that led to its defeat in a number of states where it had appeared that it was going to pass. So there's some question about, some of you may have followed it, that Virginia actually ratified that amendment in the last few months. And that there's some question about whether if a couple more states ratify it now, would that amendment become law? And it depends, if that's really a court case, if that were to happen. The Supreme Court would have to rule on whether that original deadline was constitutional or not. and whether these new ratifications would be recognized or whether it had to start all over. So I don't know that it would pass in South Carolina. I feel actually pretty sure that it wouldn't at the current time. But certainly there is a lot of talk nationwide about renewing the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment.
If you had to make an educated guess, and this is just me being curious, which states would you think are most likely to ratify the ERA that haven't already ratified it?
Oh, now there's the question is which ones have already ratified it, and I don't know those off the top of my head. I think Virginia, which is a state that you've seen swing more to the progressive side in recent years. North Carolina, if it didn't ratify it, and it might have before, because it was North Carolina was pretty progressive in the 80s and then swung the other way, and it might be swinging back. So that might be a state. It's just hard to know with the demographic changes that are happening in so many states now. I think it's possible you could see several states who did not ratify it at the time who might ratify it now.
All right, anyone, do you have any last questions for Dr. Walker?
Well, thanks, Cheryl, and I really thank all the folks at the Spartanburg County Public Libraries for all the hard work you've done to continue to make services and programs available to all of us during this really strange time.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. And Dr. Walker, once again, thank you. We look forward to doing another program with you soon. And everyone, have a wonderful evening.